Welcome, my YouTube friends. Today I'm going to be explaining using Visual Studio, ASP.NET. We'll be coding in Visual Basic how to implement dynamically objects, dynamic objects using our code behind. So to start with, we're going to be using Visual Studio 2015. We're going to go to File, New, Website. We're going to use an empty website. And this empty website we're going to call dynamic, in lowercase, dynamic objects. Let's put 101. Empty website, remember? Click OK. Now, right here in the name title that says Dynamic Objects 101, we're going to right click our mouse. We're going to add a new web form. If the web form does not display in this area, we're going to click on Add New Item. Go to Web Form. This web form we're going to call Dynamic Objects. Dynamic, and let's call it OBJ. Objects. Add. As you can see, there are other type of forms, but in this tutorial I'm going to use ASPX web form. Okay. In this ASPX web form, we see at the top that we have the language type, auto event wire up. We'll be using that later on in our next or future videos. Our code file, which basically is our code behind. Our class type, Visual Basic, ASPX, and inherits from dynamic object, which is basically inside our class type. The form ahead, let's call this dynamic objects. Form base. This div, we're going to give it a name, an identification. ID equals hold 1. Run at equal server. Why do we put run at equal server? Because we want our code behind to be able to see this identification of this div, of this object. Now that we've given a name to this div, to this object, we made sure that our code behind can actually access this object. We're going to go right click, view code, or we go to our tool or search explorer, solution explorer, click on the arrow on dynamic object ASPX and click on ASPX.Visual Basic. Let's do it a simple way. Right click, view code. Our code right now is empty, as you can see. Now what we're going to do first is add a function or add a method. So right now let's do a protected sub. Protected sub, and let's put create text box. Now, how do we create a text box dynamically? We're gonna go dim text box, give it a name. We're gonna give this new text box a name as new text box. You have to be wary that has to be new text box every time you create a dynamic object. If it's text box, if it's another type of object, that object has to be new, so you can actually classify and add it each time a new instance of that object. Now in this text box we got to give it its proper identification, ID, which is its identification. Let's call it text B. Okay, text B. Okay, in text B, text box dot attributes dot add. What do we want to add? Since I'm not going to be using labels to actually name each text box, so I'm going to use the attributes dot add and use the attribute placeholder, comma. Let's give it a name, username. What information is going to be implemented in this text box? It's going to be username, the username. Okay, and that is basically all that we need right now. Now, how do we implement this to our web page? As you can see, I haven't added anything. I haven't even used my toolbox. I haven't added anything to my web page. It's basically blank, just the form statement and the div statement. That's all that I have. And inside this div, I want that text box to show inside that div. So to show inside that div, that's why we gave it identification. That's why we see it. We added this code so we could see it in the code behind in our class. So we can use this to implement our text box dynamically. So we're gonna call that div hold1 dot controls dot add. And what are we gonna add? Well, we're gonna add the new name of the text box, not the ID. We're not gonna use the ID. We're gonna use the variable that we gave for the new text box. So we're gonna add text box. Now, just as it is right now, if we would have done that in the page load, yes, it would have worked. Actually, it would have instantaneously added the text box. But since I did it separate, we're gonna go to form load. We're gonna get the form load codification, and we're gonna create text box. Now this code will run when page load is active. When page load is active, we will create that text box. You can actually add it to a button, and the button will dynamically add the text box. But in this case, we want it to appear at runtime. So we're gonna go, okay, everything's fine. We're gonna go to dynamic object, or SPX. You can right click and view in browser, or if you want a faster way, right here we have our default browser, Google Chrome. We're gonna click the play button. Now the difference between the play button and view in browser is that it's actually building the object, the website. And at times you don't want to actually go through all the building process. You just want to open that website straight from your code. As you can see, we got the text box dynamically added, but the placeholder is not showing its values. So let's try that again. Okay, let's give it a stop. See, I wrote placeholder wrong, so that's bad for me. Placeholder, save. You will right click, view in browser. As you can see, faster than building the whole project from scratch. So you can see now it says username, and we created the text box dynamically. As you can see, I can put Alex. The placeholder goes empty, then returns. I can put Jose. Placeholder goes empty, and only the information stays, the data stays. Okay, now what if we want to add multiple text box? Well, to add multiple text box, in my case, I use a count. I need a count as integer, And I'm going to give a value of 0 for now. Now I'm going to go do while count is less than 10. I want to create 10 instances of a text box. And I'm going to put here loop. Why did I put the controller inside of the loop? Because every time the counter goes one variable, one integer higher, I want a new text box. But at the same time, I want to add that object, that text box, that object to the web page. So how we're going to do that? Right here, as you can see, count is less than 10. If count is less than 10, it's going to stop. Is equal to 10, it's going to stop. It's not going to run anymore. Now, what do we need to actually have a new object every time the loop returns to the top of the code? We're going to add text box equal new text box. Why do I have to call new again? Well, like I told you earlier, we need every time we need a new object, a freshly created new text box. So that's why we have to call new again every time we come in. Now, if we leave the identification as it is now, when we are trying to retrieve the data, it's going to call an error. Why? Because multiple objects in your website will have the same identity, the same identification. So when the way I have the workaround is I'm going to use count. Every time count is every time count will have a different value. Why it's going to have different value? Because right here I'm going to add count equal count plus 1. Count plus 1. Count plus 1 is going to go 0 plus 1, 1. Run. Then text B. The next text box is going to have a value of 1. Count equals 1 plus 1, 2. Then the next text box is going to have a value of text B with a number 2. Successively until it reaches 9. Because if it reaches 10, it will not run the code. It will just stop. Now let's run this to see how many times we get a text box, which is supposed to be 10. Okay, let's click enter. Let's see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. We got 10 text box. 10 text box dynamically. Okay, so now let's see, we already got a text box. What else can we add dynamically? Let's add labels. Let's add a label. Okay, let's create, change the name, label. Let's change the type of object, label. Let's change the name, the variable as well, so we can have, so we can be uniform in our code. Label, and okay, this part right here we can eliminate, but we can add label.text equals, let's call it label minus, and let's add the count. And right here we're gonna have to change label. Now right now I'm putting every label and every text box in the same div folder. I want to change that. I want to actually separate them so it could be more visual when we run our code. So let's create another div, copy paste a new div. Let's call it hold2, same thing, run that server, and let's give each and every one a heading, h2, and let's call this dynamic objects Let's call this text box. Okay, let's copy this, paste here. Dynamic objects, let's call this label. Labels, text box. Okay, clean. Okay, now we're gonna change the controller in which we're gonna add the label, which is gonna be hold 2. We're gonna run it the same way, and each label is supposed to go from 0 to 9, which is 10 times. Okay, now let's go to our web browser and let's refresh the page. Oh no, I didn't get my labels. Why did I not get my labels? Let's verify why we didn't get the labels. Label.text, label. Well, we're not gonna get our label because we're not calling this area, this code. We're not calling it. Where are we going to call the code? We're going to call it in the page load. So we got to add it. Create label. See, we got create text box, create label. If you do this code separately, you're going to have to add it, that instance, at some point, either a form load or a button that will actually call the request to create that dynamic object. So let's go back to our web browser. Let's refresh again, and we should have our labels. Label 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Got our 9 labels. We got our 10 labels. Sorry about that. And our 10 text box. Now, what other dynamic objects can we create? In this instance, let's create a drop-down list. I want a drop-down list. So let's create a drop-down list. Drop-down list. Let's change our object type to drop-down list. Let's call it drop L. Let's change this value to drop L. My bad, this variable. Now this object to drop-down list. Change the ID to drop L. Let's change the identification to drop L. As you can see, I did not change the variable. I just noticed that right here, the identification variable. If I were to run the same amount of label, the same amount of text box, I was going to get an error when I would try to retrieve that data. Why? Because we're going to have multiple objects with the same identification. So let me change this one to LBL. Drop L. Okay, let's remove the text because we really don't need the text. Let's put enter. Let's change this drop L. Okay, so we want each drop down list to have a count from 0 to 9. So let's do a dim I as integer equals 0. Now right here we're gonna do another do while I is less than 10. We're gonna go to drop L dot items dot add. I'm gonna add I, and I equals I plus 1. So it's gonna run 10 times. Let's see, for the drop down list with the ID of drop L1 or drop L0, it's gonna have this code right here is gonna run 10 times, so it should have from 0 to 9 successively throughout every loop. And once we go out of the central loop, this loop right here, we want that I to revert to 0. Why? Because when the code gets to here, we're gonna loop back up to the do while, and then we want to do it all over again. We can either add it here or we can add it here. It does not matter as long as you revert the code back to 0. Either at the start or at the end, the I has to revert, so we can keep that consistency of 0 to 9 on every drop-down list that we're going to create. In this case, our 9 drop-down list. Let's copy the name. Let's add it though, so we won't have the same problem as we did with the labels. Let's open our browser. Let's refresh the page. See, we got all our drop-down lists from 0 to 9. Now, oh no, I forgot to create my header and a new holding place for our object. So let's go back to our dynamic object. First, I already know that the next hold is going to be 3. So let's go here, let's go copy, paste, call this one hold 3, and let's call this drop down list. Dynamic objects, drop down list. Let's save it. Let's run again let's run again our browser. Let's see, there we go. We got them separate. And it all looks good. As you can see, you can add dynamically any type of objects basically to your web page. You just need to actually know the basics, which is basically you can either hold them all together, which is basically a text box, a drop down list, a button. Let's create some buttons, so you can see that even you can dynamically create buttons. Let's change the name to a button. Let's change the object to button. Change the variable to btn. Change this variable to btn. Let's change this object to button. The ID to btn. Now I don't need the I anymore because it's a button and I don't need to fill in any information inside the button. Now I do need to give the button a name, so I'm going to button dot text equal button minus, and let's add the count and count. We're already adding button there. Okay, let's clean up a little bit. Now the identification, I have to change it to btn, or we're gonna have the same problem when we try to retrieve the data. Let's copy, create button, enter, and paste. Now we should have an instance of the button, but I want it in a separate div. So let's call this hold 4, which is gonna hold our div that's gonna hold our buttons. Copy paste again, change the identification to hold 4, and our header, let's change the dynamic objects buttons, which is basically input box. We have all type of input boxes right now that we are inserting dynamically. So now let's run our code, and we should have buttons with their proper name labels. Button 0, button 1, button 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Right now you can see I can click them and they're not going to do anything because I haven't programmed them, given them a code to actually run. They're dynamically inputted, but I haven't yet added them to our library. So in our next video, I'm going to show you how to actually retrieve data from dynamically created objects. And just so you know, I've doing this on the fly. So basically I just sat down, gave myself a theme, and I'm showing you how to actually do it without even having any type of tutorial on my side. So you saw my errors. You will have errors. As a programmer, that's part of everything. You're gonna get errors. How you fix it, that's what distinguishes if you're a good programmer or a bad programmer. The errors will come. There are programmers that are assigned to find the errors in the code. But since you're the one coding, you should be able to identify which error and at what location it is. And if you have any questions and have any ideas of any other videos that you would like me to create or would like to have seen or see the process of any type of code or problem that you have, just write it in the comment area. I will get back to you, and I will be sure to create that video explaining the process of how to create or how to modify or problem solving. Whichever is your problem, whichever is your interest, I will find the way to do it and I will get back to you. So if anything, leave comments. Thank you for everything, guys. Have a nice day.